The arrival. The air on Zoreth was thick with tension as Ethan stepped off the transport ship. The alien city of Mir glimmered under twin suns, its crystalline spires casting rainbow-like reflections onto the bustling crowds below. Ethan adjusted his translator device, feeling the weight of hundreds of alien eyes on him. They weren't friendly. Whispers rippled through the crowd, punctuated by mocking laughter and disdainful sneers. "Why is a human here?" One alien muttered in a guttural tone. "Didn't they say this was a delegation of scholars?" "He looks more like a farmer," scoffed another. Ethan ignored the remarks, his attention drawn to the massive obsidian pedestal standing at the center of the plaza. Embedded in its surface was a sword, its blade glowing faintly with an otherworldly energy. The sword was a relic of legend, said to have been crafted by the ancients, beings who had disappeared long before the rise of Zoreth's mighty empire. For centuries, it had been a symbol of power, unmoving and unyielding to all who tried to claim it. Standing near the pedestal was Princess Thriza, the heiress to Zoreth's throne. She was tall and regal, her silver-scaled skin shimmering like molten metal. Her piercing violet eyes scanned Ethan with amusement. She leaned closer to one of her attendants and whispered something, causing them to burst into laughter. "What is so funny?" Ethan asked, his translator converting his words into the alien tongue. Thriza smirked, stepping forward with a deliberate grace. "You are human. Do you see this sword?" She gestured to the blade. "Kings, warriors, and champions of Zoreth have tried for centuries to claim it, yet it has never budged. And now, here you are, small, fragile, and utterly insignificant, daring to even look at it." The crowd erupted in laughter, their jeers echoing in the plaza. Ethan clenched his jaw, but kept his expression neutral. He had faced ridicule before, and he wasn't about to let it get to him now. "Maybe the sword doesn't care about size or strength," Ethan replied calmly. "Maybe it's waiting for someone who can use their head." The princess's eyes narrowed, her amusement replaced by irritation. "Then by all means try. Give us all a good laugh." Ethan hesitated. He hadn't planned to draw attention to himself, but something about the sword called to him. It wasn't just curiosity. It was as if an invisible thread connected him to the ancient blade. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the pedestal. The crowd fell silent, their laughter replaced by anticipation. No one truly believed he could succeed, but the audacity of his attempt intrigued them. Princess Thriza crossed her arms, her expression a mix of skepticism and disdain. Ethan placed his hand on the hilt of the sword. It was warm to the touch, as if alive. For a moment, nothing happened, and he wondered if he had been imagining the connection. Then he felt it, a surge of energy rushing up his arm, filling him with a sense of power and purpose. The sword began to hum, its glow intensifying. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The pedestal, which had remained unyielding for centuries, cracked and crumbled as Ethan effortlessly lifted the blade. The sword shone brightly, its light illuminating the shocked faces of the onlookers. Princess Thriza's mocking smirk vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. "Impossible," she whispered. Ethan turned to face her, the sword vibrating gently in his grasp. "Guess it's not about size after all," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Before Thriza could respond, the ground trembled, and a deep, resonant voice echoed from the blade. It spoke in a language no one had heard in millennia, yet Ethan understood it perfectly. "Bearer of unity," the voice intoned. "You have been chosen." The crowd recoiled, some falling to their knees in awe. Princess Thriza's face darkened, a mix of fear and resentment clouding her features. "Chosen for what?" Ethan asked aloud, but the voice faded, leaving him with more questions than answers. The plaza buzzed with chaos as the aliens tried to make sense of what had just happened. Ethan stood at the center, the sword glowing faintly in his hand. He felt a strange combination of exhilaration and dread. Whatever he had just stepped into, it was far bigger than he had anticipated. Princess Thriza stepped closer, her voice cold and accusatory. "You've made a mistake, human. That sword belongs to Zoreth. It is not yours to wield." Ethan met her glare, unflinching. "Then why did it choose me?" Threesa didn't respond. Instead, she turned and barked an order to her guards. "Escort him to the palace. If he's the chosen one, we'll see how he handles the weight of the prophecy." As the guards approached, Ethan tightened his grip on the sword. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: his life was about to change forever. The impossible feat. The vast palace chamber was bathed in golden light, its high ceilings adorned with intricate carvings of Zoreth's ancient legends. Ethan stood in the center, sword in hand, feeling out of place amid the grandeur and the intense stares of the alien council. Princess Threesa sat at the head of the room, her sharp features shadowed by a crown of luminescent crystals. Her expression was unreadable, but her violet eyes burned with questions she didn't yet voice. The council murmured amongst themselves, their words a mix of awe and suspicion. "This human is unworthy," one elder growled, his scaled skin shimmering with irritation. "But the sword chose him," another argued, her voice laced with reluctant awe. "This hasn't happened in over 1,000 cycles. Perhaps it's a mistake," Threesa interjected, her tone calm but pointed. "The sword's wisdom is beyond us, but humans have never been considered. Remarkable." Ethan bristled at her comment but kept his focus steady. He wasn't here to argue. He wanted answers. Clearing his throat, he addressed the room. "I didn't ask for this, and I don't know why the sword chose me. But if it did, I need to understand what that means." Threesa leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "The sword is not just a weapon. It's a relic tied to our history and our future. Legends say it will only awaken for one destined to unite or destroy entire civilizations. So, tell us, human," she said, her voice tinged with mockery. "What makes you so special?" Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sword pulsed with a faint light. The room fell silent as the glow intensified, projecting an image into the air. A translucent figure, robed in flowing garments of light, appeared. The figure's face was obscured, but its voice was deep and resonant. "Bearer of unity," it began, addressing Ethan. "You have been chosen to wield the blade of balance. The galaxy stands on the brink of chaos, and only one with a heart untainted by greed or fear can restore harmony." The council erupted into a frenzy of voices, but Ethan's attention remained on the figure. "Why me?" he asked. "I'm just an archaeologist, not a hero." The figure's gaze seemed to pierce through him. "It is not your strength or skill that matters, but your spirit. You will face trials that will test your resolve. The sword will guide you, but its power comes at a cost." As the figure faded, Ethan felt the weight of the sword grow heavier in his hand. He staggered slightly, but a firm voice broke through the silence. "Enough," Threesa said, rising from her seat. Her voice carried authority, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "If this prophecy is true, then the human must prove himself. Words alone are not enough." Ethan sighed. "And how do you suggest I prove myself?" Threesa smirked, though it lacked her usual confidence. "A duel, here and now. If you are truly chosen, the sword will protect you." The room filled with murmurs of approval, and the tension grew palpable. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't a warrior, and the idea of fighting an alien princess who was likely trained in combat since birth wasn't appealing. But the way the sword seemed to hum in agreement gave him pause. "Fine," he said, gripping the hilt tightly. "Let's get this over with." The chamber was quickly cleared, leaving a wide-open space. Threesa stepped into the circle, her silver armor gleaming under the light. She drew a sleek blade that seemed to vibrate with energy, a weapon that matched her sharp, calculating demeanor. Ethan took his place opposite her, the ancient sword feeling both alien and familiar in his grip. A gong sounded, signaling the start of the duel. Threesa moved first, her speed startling. She lunged with precision, her blade aimed at Ethan's shoulder. He barely managed to deflect the strike, the sword moving almost instinctively in his hands. Each clash of their weapons sent sparks flying, and the crowd watched in stunned silence. Despite his lack of training, Ethan found himself keeping up with Threesa. The sword seemed to guide his movements, anticipating her strikes and countering with a fluid grace that felt unnatural. Threesa's initial confidence began to waver as she realized she wasn't fighting a novice but someone, or something, far more formidable. "You're not even trying, are you?" she hissed, her strikes growing more aggressive. "I told you. I didn't ask for this," Ethan replied, dodging another blow. "But if this sword wants me to fight, I'll fight." Their duel reached a crescendo as Ethan deflected a powerful strike, causing Threesa to stumble. He pointed the sword at her, its blade glowing brightly. "Enough," she shouted, dropping her weapon and raising her hands in surrender. The crowd erupted in whispers, their disbelief palpable. Ethan lowered the sword, breathing heavily. He didn't feel like a victor, but the looks on the council's faces told him he had earned their reluctant respect. Threesa stood, brushing off her armor. Her gaze was intense, but there was a hint of something else. Admiration, perhaps. "You're still unremarkable," she said, her tone softer. "But maybe there's more to you than meets the eye." Ethan sheathed the sword, his mind racing with questions. The duel was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The prophecy. The duel may have ended, but the echoes of its impact reverberated far beyond the palace chamber. Ethan's unexpected victory had left the council divided, the citizens of Zoreth buzzing with rumors of the human who wielded the blade of balance. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself an unwilling participant in a whirlwind of ceremonies and interrogations. Seated in a vast library adorned with glowing orbs of light, he faced Princess Threesa across a polished stone table. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the orbs and the occasional flutter of pages from the archives around them. Threesa was studying him intently, her piercing violet eyes scanning for any sign of weakness. "You do realize," she began, breaking the silence, "that this changes everything. The prophecy, the sword choosing you. It's not just about you. It's about the entire galaxy." Ethan leaned back, gripping the hilt of the sword that rested by his side. "You keep mentioning this prophecy, but no one's explained it to me. All I know is that a glowing ghost told me I was chosen. That's not exactly a detailed briefing." Threesa sighed, her sharp features softening for a moment. "The prophecy is ancient, written long before even our oldest records. It speaks of a time when the galaxy would face its greatest peril, divided by war and greed. Only a bearer of unity, someone pure of spirit, could restore balance. The sword is the key, but it chooses its wielder." "And you think I'm this bearer of unity?" Ethan asked skeptically. "I'm just an archaeologist. I study relics. I don't wield them." Threesa leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The sword doesn't make mistakes, but there's more to the prophecy than what I told you. Some say the bearer has the power to unite the galaxy, or to destroy it." Ethan stiffened. "Destroy it?" Threesa nodded grimly. "The sword's power is immense, but it's not inherently good or evil. It amplifies the wielder's intent. In the wrong hands, it could bring devastation." Before Ethan could respond, an attendant entered the room, bowing deeply. "Your Highness, we've located the missing fragments of the prophecy. They're being prepared in the Hall of Echoes." Threesa stood abruptly, her expression unreadable. "We'll continue this discussion there." The Hall of Echoes was a vast chamber carved into the heart of the mountain beneath the palace. Its walls were lined with glowing crystalline inscriptions, the air thick with a sense of age and mystery. As Ethan and Threesa entered, the chamber resonated with a low hum, as if the very room was alive. At the center of the hall stood a pedestal holding a translucent crystal tablet. Elders surrounded it, their expressions somber. One of them, an ancient Zorethian with scales faded to a dull gray, turned to face Threesa and Ethan. "The fragments have been reassembled," he said, his voice trembling with both awe and fear. "But what they reveal is troubling." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he read the inscriptions glowing on the tablet. The prophecy was written in a language he didn't recognize, but the sword at his side began to hum softly, the words translating in his mind. "When the galaxies fracture and unity lies in ruins, the bearer of balance shall rise. Her spirit will guide the blade, a force to unite or obliterate. Beware the shadow of betrayal, for the closest ally may become the sharpest dagger." Ethan's stomach churned. A betrayal. What does that mean? Threesa's expression darkened. "It means we can't trust anyone, not fully. Someone close to us, someone we rely on, could turn against us." Ethan glanced around the room, suddenly aware of the distrustful eyes of the elders fixed on him. "Let me guess, you think that someone might be me?" Theresa didn't deny it. "The sword chose you, and that makes you both a potential savior and a potential threat." Ethan felt a surge of frustration. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want the sword, the prophecy, or the attention. If I'm such a threat, why not just take the sword and let me leave?" Theresa stepped closer, her voice low and intense. "Because it doesn't work that way. The sword chose you, and that choice is final. Like it or not, you're part of this now." As they left the Hall of Echoes, the weight of the prophecy pressed heavily on Ethan's shoulders. He had come to Zoreth to study its history, not to become a part of it. Now he was caught in a web of intrigue, his every move scrutinized. Theresa walked beside him, her usual confidence tinged with an uncharacteristic hesitance. "I don't trust you yet," she admitted, breaking the silence. "But the prophecy doesn't leave us much choice. If you truly are the bearer, then we need you." Ethan stopped and turned to face her. "And if I'm not?" Theresa's gaze hardened. "Then we're all doomed." The words hung in the air as they stood in the shadow of the palace, the twin suns dipping below the horizon. Ethan looked down at the sword in his hand, its glow faint but steady. Whether he was ready or not, he had a role to play in the fate of the galaxy. But as the shadow of betrayal loomed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his greatest challenge was yet to come. The hidden enemy. The palace corridors buzzed with an unease that was impossible to ignore. Word of the prophecy had spread like wildfire, and while many hailed Ethan as a possible savior, others saw him as a dangerous outsider. Princess Theresa, ever the skeptic, had assigned him a small chamber deep within the palace, a compromise between keeping him under watch and granting him a semblance of freedom. Ethan sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, the blade of balance resting across his lap. He studied it carefully, trying to unravel the mystery of its power. The sword seemed alive, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Whenever he touched it, he felt a strange hum in his mind, as if the weapon was trying to communicate with him. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Before he could respond, the door creaked open, and Theresa stepped in. She looked more tense than usual, her silver-scaled skin shimmering under the soft glow of the chamber's light. "We've had an incident," she said curtly, crossing her arms. Ethan stood, his brow furrowing. "What kind of incident?" Theresa hesitated, as if weighing how much to share. "A disturbance in the archives. Someone tampered with the records of the prophecy. Whoever it was tried to destroy the fragments we just studied." Ethan's grip on the sword tightened. "Any idea who's behind it?" "That's the problem," Theresa replied, her voice edged with frustration. "The palace is on high alert, but whoever did this is still inside. Worse, we suspect they had help." The two made their way to the archives, a labyrinth of towering shelves, filled with glowing tablets and ancient scrolls. The air was thick with the scent of aged parchment and the faint hum of security wards. When they arrived, several guards were already inspecting the damage. One of the tablets containing the prophecy had been shattered, its fragments scattered across the floor. An elder approached, bowing slightly to Theresa. "Your Highness, the wards detected unauthorized access just before the tablet was destroyed. The intruder escaped through the ventilation system, but we're certain they're still within the palace. Ethan crouched beside the broken tablet, examining the fragments. The damage looked deliberate, not the result of panic or desperation. Someone had known exactly what they were doing. Whoever did this didn't want the prophecy to be understood, he said, standing. But why? If the prophecy is about uniting the galaxy, wouldn't everyone want that? Threesa shook her head. Not everyone. Some believe unity threatens their power. The galaxy's factions thrive on division. An empire without war would make their influence meaningless. Ethan frowned, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. Then this isn't just about the prophecy. It's about control. As they left the archives, Threesa's personal communicator chimed. She glanced at the screen and scowled. Another disturbance, this time in the Hall of Echoes. Ethan followed her as they rushed to the hall, his heart pounding. The Hall of Echoes was eerily quiet when they arrived, but something was off. The crystal inscriptions on the walls flickered erratically, and a strange energy crackled in the air. Threesa motioned for Ethan to stay back as she drew her weapon and stepped cautiously into the chamber. Ethan, unable to resist, followed close behind, the blade of balance in hand. A shadow moved across the far wall, darting between the crystalline pillars. Ethan's grip tightened on the sword as he scanned the room. The shadow moved again, and this time, Threesa was faster. She leaped forward, slashing at the figure. To Ethan's shock, the shadow wasn't a rebel or a soldier. It was one of the palace guards. The Zorathian, a tall, armored figure with dark scales, raised his hands in mock surrender, a sly smile playing across his lips. "Caught me," the guard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you're too late." Ethan and Threesa exchanged a glance before Threesa stepped forward, her blade pointed at the guard's chest. "Who are you working for? What have you done?" The guard chuckled, unfazed by the weapon. "You think this is about the prophecy? You're so naive, princess. This is about survival. The galaxy doesn't need unity, it needs strength. And your little human here is a threat to everything we've built." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? What have I done?" "You exist," the guard sneered. "That's enough. The sword chose you, and now every faction, every power-hungry leader in the galaxy, will either want to control you or kill you. Do you think you can handle that kind of responsibility?" Before Ethan could respond, the guard reached into his armor and pressed a device. A blinding flash filled the room, and when it subsided, the guard was gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of ozone. Threesa cursed under her breath, sheathing her weapon. "This is worse than I thought. If he's right, then you're a target, not just here, but everywhere." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "If everyone's coming for me, what do we do now?" Threesa turned to him, her expression uncharacteristically serious. "We find out who's pulling the strings, and we stop them before they stop you." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan nodded, gripping the sword tightly. The road ahead was becoming more dangerous with every step, but there was no turning back now. He was in the center of a game far bigger than himself, and the stakes were higher than he ever could have imagined. The betrayal. The tension in the palace had reached a breaking point. Ethan felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down on him more with each passing day. The sword had chosen him, but he still had no idea why. His every action was now scrutinized, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Threesa had been distant, her guarded demeanor making it clear that trust didn't come easily to the Princess of Zoreth. She'd been taught all her life to protect her people, and now, in this strange and unforeseen turn of events, she was forced to rely on a human. A human who, as far as she could tell, might be the key to her survival or her destruction. Ethan spent most of his days in seclusion, locked in his chamber, studying the blade of balance. The sword had become an enigma, guiding his thoughts, speaking to him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd learned that the sword's power was tied to its wielder's emotions, fear, anger, hope. It would amplify whatever feelings dominated his mind. In a way, it made him a prisoner of his own mind. He couldn't afford to let any dark impulses take over. If he did, the sword could very well consume him. But that wasn't what troubled him the most. It was Threesa's recent actions. Her aloofness had only grown since the events in the Hall of Echoes. She avoided him during council meetings, preferring the company of her advisors and generals. It felt as though something had shifted between them, something unspoken. She no longer looked at him as the untested archaeologist from Earth, but as the potential weapon that could either save or doom them all. It was during one of these silent days that Ethan felt the shift take place, a betrayal that would change everything. He had been summoned by Threesa for a private audience in her quarters. There was no indication of what this meeting would be about, but Ethan could sense that it was important. When he arrived, he was met with the usual formalities. The cold reception, the stiff posture, but this time, something felt different. Threesa was sitting by the window, her back turned to him. Her voice, when she spoke, was distant, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You've done well, Ethan," she said quietly, her tone betraying nothing. "You've lived up to the prophecy. You've shown strength when none expected it. But the time for tests is over." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He'd been expecting a confrontation, a challenge, but this felt like something more, something deeper. "What are you saying, Threesa?" he asked cautiously. She turned to face him, her violet eyes hard as ice. For a moment, they locked eyes, and for the first time since he'd met her, Ethan saw something that chilled him to his core: doubt. It wasn't directed at him, but at something else, something darker. "There's something you don't understand, Ethan," Threesa said, standing up and pacing. "You think the sword will lead us to salvation. But the truth is, the galaxy isn't ready for unity. Not yet. It will tear us apart." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "What are you talking about? The prophecy said the sword would unite us. It said." She cut him off with a sharp gesture, her face contorting with frustration. "The prophecy is a weapon too. You're not the only one who believes in its power. Others do as well, people who would stop at nothing to control you. People I trusted." Ethan's confusion grew, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. "What do you mean? Who's trying to control me? And why are you telling me this now?" Threesa's eyes softened, but only for a second. Her next words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "I never wanted to betray you, Ethan. I never wanted to hurt you. But the truth is, the sword is a threat to everything I've worked for. And there are those within my own circle who believe the same." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I was one of them." Ethan's world tilted. Betrayal. The word echoed in his mind, but he couldn't make sense of it. Threesa, a traitor. The woman who had fought alongside him, who had trusted him with the fate of her people. You were trying to use me." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression torn between regret and resolve. "At first, yes. I thought if I could control you, if I could control the sword, I could protect Zoreth. But when I saw the power you wielded, when I saw what the sword could do, I knew that I was no different from the others who would try to use it for their own gain." Ethan felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. "So what now? You're telling me this, but you've already made your decision, haven't you?" Threesa turned away, her back to him once more. The moment of vulnerability was gone, replaced by the stoic resolve that had always defined her. "There's no going back, Ethan. If I don't do this, if I don't stop you, everything I've fought for will crumble. The sword is too powerful. It cannot remain in your hands." A chill spread through Ethan's chest. It wasn't just about her. It was about the whole galaxy. Threesa wasn't the only one who had seen the sword as a potential weapon for control. And now she had chosen her side. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. He had no choice but to act. He was no longer just a visitor on Zoreth. He was the key to everything. And if Threesa had already turned against him, there was no telling who else would follow. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Frieza's voice echoed softly from behind him. "I truly am. But the galaxy is bigger than you or me. The sword must be destroyed, or it will destroy us all." With that, the door slammed shut behind him, and Ethan was left in the dark. The betrayal had begun, but who else would follow? Would the sword ever truly be a tool for peace, or would it lead them all to ruin? There was only one way to find out. And Ethan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. The eclipse. The days leading up to the prophesied eclipse were filled with unease. The sun had started to wane, casting a reddish hue over Zoreth's twin suns. As Ethan walked through the palace corridors, he could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The people of Zoreth were restless, whispers of rebellion simmering just beneath the surface. While some hoped the sword would bring peace, others saw it as a threat to their centuries-old way of life. And Ethan, the human who had become the galaxy's unlikely savior, was at the center of it all. Ethan had learned to move carefully. Frieza's betrayal still stung, but he couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. The prophecy was clear. The sword was a force for unity or destruction, and no one, not even Frieza, had the full picture of its power. But what if the prophecy was wrong? What if the sword wasn't a symbol of hope, but a tool for war? It was during one of these long, restless nights that the palace was shaken by an explosion. The walls trembled, sending dust and debris falling from the ceiling. Ethan had just sat down in his room to study the ancient scrolls, hoping to find something that would explain the sword's true power. Now, the palace was in chaos. He rushed to the source of the disturbance, only to find Frieza standing at the entrance to the palace courtyard, her face pale. A violent wind whipped through the air, carrying the scent of smoke and burning metal. The sky above had darkened prematurely, the eclipse beginning ahead of schedule. "The rebels are here," Frieza said, her voice shaking. "They've breached the outer gates. They were waiting for this moment." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew the eclipse was the moment the prophecy foretold, when the sword's true power would either unite or shatter the galaxy. But he had never imagined it would come like this, in the middle of an assault on the palace. A group of soldiers, led by Frieza's most trusted general, approached them. His face was grim. "Your Highness, we've been breached. The rebel leader has rallied an army. We're not prepared for this kind of assault. The sword, if we could use it, might give us a fighting chance." Ethan's gaze flickered to Frieza, who had become noticeably quieter in recent days. The trust between them had broken, and the weight of the moment was heavy on her shoulders. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Ethan, then back to the chaos unfolding beyond the courtyard walls. "I don't have a choice," she whispered, almost to herself. "The prophecy said the sword could either unite or destroy. If we don't act now, everything I've worked for will fall apart." Ethan stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of the blade of balance. The sword hummed, as though recognizing the urgency in the air. "Then let's make sure it unites, not destroys." The battlefield outside the palace gates was chaotic. Zoreth's elite soldiers fought valiantly, but the rebels, armed with advanced weaponry and backed by an alliance of factions, were relentless. The ground trembled with the force of explosions, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. On the horizon, the twin suns had begun their final descent, signaling the full onset of the eclipse. Ethan and Frieza stood at the front of the palace walls, watching as the rebels stormed the gates. Frieza's gaze was fixed on the oncoming wave of soldiers, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't just a princess now, she was a commander. And she had to make a choice: use the sword to fight and risk its destructive power, or let the rebels win and risk losing everything. "You can still back out," Ethan said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "This doesn't have to be the final battle." Frieza turned to face him, her expression colder than ever. "I can't. If the sword truly is the key to peace, then this is the test we must face. But if it's the weapon of war that the rebels think it is, then we'll be prepared to use it. Ethan felt the weight of her words. He didn't know if the sword could bring peace, but in this moment he realized that he wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting for Zoreth, for its people, and for the future of the galaxy. The eclipse was more than just a celestial event. It was the defining moment of their future. And whether he was ready or not, he had to play his part. The battle raged on for hours, the clash of metal and the hum of energy weapons filling the air. Ethan wielded the blade of balance with a newfound determination, his movements guided by the sword's mysterious power. Each strike felt almost like an extension of himself, as though the blade had become part of him. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of everything he had come to believe in: unity, strength, and the possibility of peace. But as the rebel leader approached, the same figure who had once taunted Threesa with promises of chaos, Ethan felt the sword's power surge with an intensity he had never experienced before. The rebel leader, a towering alien with dark, scorched skin and eyes full of fire, raised his weapon, his expression twisted with hatred. "You think you can stop us, human?" The rebel leader spat, his voice dripping with venom. "The galaxy is ours to claim. You are nothing." Ethan stepped forward, the blade of balance glowing with an eerie light. "I am more than you think." The rebel leader lunged, but Ethan was faster. With a single fluid movement, he swung the sword, its edge glowing brighter than ever before. The rebel leader's weapon shattered under the force of the strike, and the shockwave sent him sprawling backward. The battle stopped, if only for a moment, as everyone watched in stunned silence. Ethan stood tall, the sword humming softly in his hands. But before he could make another move, a voice from behind him called out, sharp and commanding. "Enough." Threesa appeared, her face resolute. She stepped between Ethan and the rebel leader, her presence commanding the attention of both sides. "This battle ends now," Threesa said, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Zoreth will not be divided any longer." Ethan looked at her, surprised by the change in her tone. For the first time since they had met, Threesa wasn't just the princess. She was the leader she was meant to be. She had made her choice. The rebel leader glared at her, but he knew defeat when he saw it. The sword, its power undeniable, had shifted the tide. The rebels had lost. The eclipse reached its peak, casting the entire battlefield in a haunting twilight. The blade of balance, its glow now dimming, hummed softly as the last of the rebels surrendered. Threesa turned to Ethan, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and something deeper, something like understanding. "We did it," she said, though it wasn't clear if she was speaking to him or to herself. Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were clouded. The sword had saved them, but it had also exposed the fragility of the galaxy's peace. The future was still uncertain. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but at what cost? One thing was clear: the sword's true test had only just begun. The unity. The aftermath of the battle was eerily quiet. The dust had settled, and the distant rumble of the rebels' retreating forces was the only sound that broke the stillness. Zoreth's courtyard, once a battleground of fierce combat, now lay in a fragile peace. The flickering light of the eclipse faded, casting the landscape in the muted glow of two suns rising from opposite horizons. Ethan stood in the center of it all, the blade of balance still glowing softly in his hand. The sword, its power ebbing with the eclipse's final moments, felt heavy now, more than just a weapon. It was the weight of all that had transpired: the decisions, the betrayals, the desperate fight for survival. His chest still heaved with the remnants of adrenaline, but there was no victory dance, no celebration. There was only the reality of what had been done and what lay ahead. Beside him, Threesa surveyed the damage. Her silver-scaled face, once hardened by duty, now held a mix of exhaustion and cautious optimism. She was no longer the distant princess, the cold ruler who saw Ethan as a pawn. No, this was the leader who had seen firsthand the cost of leadership, the complexity of power, and the unbearable weight of choices that affected entire worlds. For a long moment, neither spoke. They both knew that the battle was not the true challenge. The true test had always been what came after. The fragile peace that had been forged in blood and fire, and whether it could be held together. Finally, Frieza broke the silence. It's done. The rebels are gone for now. And the prophecy. It was real, Ethan. But it wasn't just about the sword. It was about what we do with it now. Ethan nodded slowly, glancing down at the blade of balance, still pulsating faintly in his hands. He wasn't sure what the sword's true power was, or if it could truly bring peace. What he did know was that it had amplified what was already within him, and Frieza. Their choices, their leadership, their decisions had shaped the galaxy's future. The sword had merely shown them the way. I thought the sword would lead to an answer, Ethan said quietly. But in the end, it was up to us. The sword didn't decide who we became. Frieza turned to him, her eyes softening. It's always been up to us, hasn't it? We've just been looking for the right guidance. Ethan met her gaze, his thoughts swirling. The weight of his role as the bearer of the blade of balance had never been more apparent. The galaxy had teetered on the brink of destruction, and now it rested in their hands, his hands. We're not finished yet, he said after a pause. The galaxy is still divided. There are still those who would seek to exploit the power we've just seen. The rebels were just the beginning. Frieza's expression hardened, the resolve that had helped her lead the battle still burning within her. Then we continue. We build from this moment. We forge a true alliance, not just a temporary truce. We show them what unity looks like. Ethan smiled, though it was a tired, weary smile. I think it's going to take more than just a sword to convince them. Frieza nodded. No more relying on relics and prophecies. We have to do this ourselves. As leaders, not just of Zoreth, but of every faction that is watching us now. The next few days were a blur of negotiations, strategies, and hard choices. The rebels, now leaderless, were scattered, but their ideology still lingered. Frieza and Ethan had to work quickly to secure the peace, meeting with various factions across the galaxy to ensure that no one would seize the opportunity to plunge Zoreth, and the rest of the galaxy, into war again. At times, it felt like walking on a razor's edge. The political landscape was fragile, and one wrong move could send everything crashing down. But with each step, Ethan could see something new forming, something that had been missing for too long. Trust, not just between him and Frieza, but between the people of Zoreth and the factions of the galaxy. For the first time, they were united not just by circumstance, but by shared purpose. In one of the final meetings, as they stood before the council, Frieza addressed the gathered leaders. We have seen the consequences of division. Our worlds, our peoples, are too far apart to stand alone. But together, we are unstoppable. We've made mistakes, yes, but today we begin to build something better. Ethan stood by her side, his hand still resting on the blade of balance, though it no longer hummed with the intense power it once had. It was clear now that the sword's power wasn't what they needed most. It was the unity between them all, the strength of their collective will, that would determine their fate. In the quiet moments that followed the meetings, Ethan found himself staring out at the horizon. The twin suns had set, and the sky was clear, the first stars of the night beginning to twinkle above. The chaos of the last few weeks had faded into the background, and for the first time since he arrived on Zoreth, he felt a deep sense of calm. The galaxy wasn't saved, but it had a chance he hadn't thought possible when he first picked up the sword. Behind him, Frieza approached, her footsteps soft against the palace floor. She stood next to him, looking out over the land as well. It's not over, she said softly, her voice tinged with both hope and resolve. But we're finally on the right path. Ethan nodded, turning to face her. We've taken the first step, together. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the sword between them. But now, It was no longer a burden. It was a symbol of their choices, their sacrifices, and the future they had created. Together, they had brought balance to a galaxy teetering on the edge of collapse. And together, they would ensure that the balance remained, long after the sword had faded into legend. As the stars above them continued to shine, Ethan and Threesa stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. The sword had fulfilled its purpose, and now it was time for them to shape the future together.